She came with nothing but a frying pan, and left with a native husband, a ranch, and a family. That's what they say anyway. The story gets passed around like a cheap bottle in the dead of winter, each man adding a little bit of his own dust and spit to it before handing it off. But the bones of it, the real sharp parts that stick in your gut, they stay the same. It started with the heat, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and the horizon dance, a heat that sucks the spit right out of your mouth before you can even think to swallow. The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated everything, got in your eyes, in your throat, in the creases of your skin. It was the color of old blood, and in the middle of this shimmering, dusty hell was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 17, maybe 18, but the look in her eyes was ancient. They were flat. Not scared, not angry, just empty, like two windows on a burned-out cabin. She stood on a rickety wooden platform in the center of what passed for a town, a place called Redemption's Folly, which tells you everything you need to know about it. Her hands were bound in front of her with a length of rough rope, the fibers already having rubbed her wrists raw. You could see the angry red marks, the little beads of blood welling up where the skin had broken. She wore a dress that was once probably a decent color, but now it was just the color of the road, ripped at the shoulder and stained with God knows what. Her hair was a tangled mess, caked with that same red dust. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there while a man with a greasy beard and a missing tooth hollered about her virtues. "Strong back," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Good for field work, good for housework. Barely eats a thing. Won't give you no trouble." He said it like he was selling a mule. And to the men gathered around, that's all she was. A piece of livestock, a tool. They squinted up at her, their faces hard and sun-baked, chewing on bits of straw or tobacco, their eyes crawling over her like flies on a carcass. They weren't seeing a person. They were seeing a pair of hands, a body to be used until it broke. The silence from her was the loudest thing in that whole damned place. It was heavier than the heat, thicker than the dust. Every man there was making noise, the auctioneer yelling, the crowd muttering, horses stamping their feet. But her silence just swallowed it all. It was a defiant silence, an absolute refusal to give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a plea. Tucked into the rope at her waist, almost like an afterthought, was a black cast-iron frying pan. It was heavy, scarred from 100 fires, its handle worn smooth. It looked ridiculous, a piece of a kitchen tied to a girl being sold in the dirt. But she was holding on to it, or at least the rope was holding it to her, and it was the only thing in the whole world that seemed to belong to her. A man in a sweat-stained hat finally made a bid, a few silver coins that he spat on before tossing them onto the platform. The greasy auctioneer scooped them up, bit one to make sure it was real. Another man offered a tired-looking horse. The bidding was slow, ugly. It was a transaction of desperation and cruelty. Every clink of a coin was like a hammer blow. You could smell the sweat and the cheap whiskey on the air, the unwashed bodies of the men, the manure from the street. You could feel the grit between your own teeth just watching, and through it all, she just stood there, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the leering faces, beyond the dusty street, beyond the miserable scrap of a town. She was somewhere else, and you got the feeling that wherever that was, it was a place they could never touch, no matter what they did to her body. The final price was a lame horse, a bag of beans, and 20 silver dollars. The auctioneer kicked the back of her legs to make her kneel so the new owner, a pig farmer with cruel little eyes, could untie the rope from the post. He grabbed the end of the rope, the part still tied around her wrists, and gave it a hard yank. She stumbled forward, nearly fell, but caught herself. She didn't make a sound. She just kept her eyes on that far-off point on the horizon, her jaw set like stone. He was about to lead her away, his property, his new thing to use and break. The dust swirled around her feet, and the sun beat down, and the silence she carried with her was a weapon, the only one she had, except for the frying pan, banging softly against her hip, a forgotten piece of a life that was already dead and buried. This story's just getting started, and there's a long, hard road ahead for that girl. If you're liking it so far, do me a favor. It helps me know you're out there. Drop a comment, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you ain't subscribed yet, now's a real good time to hit that button so you don't miss what happens next. You're not gonna want to. Now, let's get back to it. He wasn't supposed to be there. Cale didn't come to town unless he absolutely had to. He hated the noise, the smell of it, the way people looked at him. They saw his dark hair, his high cheekbones, the color of his skin, and they saw a ghost, a relic of a time they were trying to pave over and forget. He preferred the quiet of his land, the company of the wind and the hawks, but his salt was low, and his traps needed mending wire. So he'd ridden in, his face a mask of indifference, planning to get what he needed and be gone before the sun was high. He was standing in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge, watching the smoke curl into the merciless sky. When the shouting started, he didn't pay it much mind at first. It was just the usual noise of a place like Redemption's Folly, drunks and fools. But the tone of it, the ugly crowing sound of that auctioneer's voice, it snagged on something inside him. He saw the platform. He saw the girl. He'd seen it before. Not like this, not a white girl, but the selling of people was a familiar kind of poison. He saw the men, the way their eyes stripped her bare. He saw her stillness. That's what got him. It wasn't fear. It was something harder, something he recognized. He'd seen it in a wolf caught in a trap right before it tried to chew its own leg off. A terrible, silent resolve. He had no reason to get involved. His life was built on a foundation of non-involvement. He'd learned the hard way that caring for things only meant you had more to lose. His world had shrunk to the borders of his homestead, to the 2 quiet mounds of earth behind his cabin. That was his penance, to be alone, to not interfere. He watched the pig farmer, a man named Barlow he knew by sight, a mean-spirited brute who beat his animals. He watched Barlow tug on the rope, and something in Cale's chest went tight. It was a physical thing, a hot clench in his gut. He saw the raw skin on her wrists. He saw the pan tied to her waist, a frying pan so absurd, so domestic, a thing from a home, a ghost of a life. Barlow started to drag her toward the stinking alley next to the saloon, and Cale moved. He didn't think about it. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was more like a reflex, like pulling your hand from a fire. He just stepped out of the shadows. He didn't say a word. He just stood in Barlow's path. Barlow looked up, annoyed. "Get out of my way, Injun." Cale's face didn't change. His eyes were flat, just as empty as the girl's, but his were a different kind of empty, a dangerous kind. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, heavy nugget of gold. It wasn't huge, but it was pure, and it was more than Barlow had paid. More than Barlow had probably seen in a year. He held it out on his open palm. Barlow's greedy little eyes fixed on the gold. He licked his lips. "What's that for?" he grunted. Kyle just looked at him. The silence stretched. The girl had stopped, her head slightly turned, watching them. It was the first sign of interest she'd shown in anything. Kyle gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the girl. Barlow understood. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "She's gonna cost you more than that," he sneered, trying to get more. Cale didn't move. He didn't bargain. He just closed his hand around the gold nugget and started to turn away. Panic flashed in Barlow's eyes. He knew he'd overplayed his hand. "Wait," he called out. "All right, fine." Kyle turned back. He opened his hand again. Barlow snatched the gold and, in the same motion, shoved the filthy end of the rope into Cale's hand. The transaction was complete. Cale didn't look at the girl. He pulled a knife from his belt, its blade clean and sharp, and with one quick fluid motion he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The frayed ends fell away. She rubbed her chafed skin, her eyes never leaving his face. He didn't speak. He just turned and started walking toward his horse, which was tied in front of the general store. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence behind him, a small, silent shadow in the oppressive heat. He had just bought himself a whole world of trouble, and he knew it. He had broken his own first rule, but as he swung himself up onto his horse, he heard the soft clank of a frying pan, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of his life felt a little less empty. The ride back to his homestead was long and silent. The sun beat down on them, and the only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves and the rhythmic, soft clanking of the iron pan against her leg. He didn't offer her a ride. He only had the one horse and the supplies he'd yet to buy. He walked, leading the horse, and she walked behind him, keeping a steady pace. She didn't complain. She didn't falter. When they finally left the last traces of the town behind and entered the high country, the air grew cooler, cleaner. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all granite and pine and wide open sky. His cabin wasn't much, a small, solid structure made of thick logs, chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a lean-to was built against the side for firewood. It was isolated, tucked into a small valley with a creek running through it. It was a place you had to want to find. He led the horse to the trough, unburdened it, and then turned to her. She was standing in the yard, looking at the cabin, her hand resting on the handle of her frying pan. She looked small against the vastness of the wilderness. He gestured toward the cabin door with his chin. In. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. She hesitated for only a second before walking past him and into the cabin. The inside was sparse and clean. A single room, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a cot in the corner, and shelves on the wall holding a few pots, dried herbs, and some books. It smelled of wood smoke and pine. He pointed to the cot. "That's yours." She just nodded, setting her frying pan down on the floor beside the cot with a quiet thud. It was the first time she'd let go of it. He went about his business, ignoring her. He started a fire in the hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. He took a slab of dried meat and some beans and put them in a pot with water from the bucket by the door, setting it over the flames to cook. The smell of stew soon began to fill the small space. It wasn't a welcoming smell, just a practical one. The smell of survival. He saw her looking at her wrists. The rope burns were ugly, the skin broken and inflamed. He went to one of the shelves and took down a small clay pot. He walked over to her. He didn't ask. He just took her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. His grip was firm, not cruel. He opened the pot, which was filled with a dark, pungent-smelling salve. He scooped some out with his finger and began to gently, methodically, work it into the raw wounds. His touch was impersonal, like a doctor or a veterinarian. He was just fixing a problem, but it was the first human touch she'd received that wasn't violent or lecherous. He wrapped clean strips of cloth around her wrists. When he was done, he let go of her arm and went back to the fire without a word. She stood there, looking at her bandaged wrists, then at his broad back as he stirred the stew. Later, when the food was ready, he ladled it into 2 wooden bowls. He set one on the table for himself and handed the other one to her. He didn't invite her to the table. There was only one chair. She sat on the edge of the cot and ate, her eyes downcast. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against the wooden bowls. It wasn't a companionable silence. It was a shared solitude. 2 wounded animals in the same den, too wary to get close, but finding a strange sort of comfort in not being entirely alone. When she finished, she took her bowl and her pan to the water bucket, washed them thoroughly, and set them by the hearth to dry. It was a simple, domestic act, but in the starkness of that cabin, it felt significant, a silent promise that she intended to pull her own weight. That night she lay on the cot, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. He sat in the chair by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the flickering light playing across his stern face. He didn't sleep. He watched. Not watching her, exactly, but watching over the cabin, a silent guardian at the edge of the darkness. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she slept without fear of what the morning would bring. Days bled into one another, in a routine of silent work. He would rise before the sun, chop wood, check his trap lines. She would wake soon after, fetch water from the creek, tend the fire, cook what little food they had. She used her frying pan for everything, cooking flatbread on the embers, frying slices of salted meat, even heating water. It was an extension of her. They moved around each other with a quiet efficiency, learning each other's rhythms without ever speaking of them. There was no sentiment. It was all necessity. He mended a tear in her dress with a bone needle and deer sinew, his large hands surprisingly deft. She organized his cluttered shelves, putting things in an order that made a quiet kind of sense. It was a language of action, a conversation held in gestures. One afternoon, he found her standing by the two small mounds of earth behind the cabin. They were marked with simple wooden crosses weathered by the sun and snow. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at them, her head tilted. He came to stand beside her, his presence a solid weight. The silence stretched for a long time, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. "My wife," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed to the larger mound. "My son." He pointed to the smaller one. He didn't say how. He didn't need to. The story was in the starkness of the graves, in the isolation of the cabin, in the permanent winter in his eyes. He had built his life around this loss, a fortress of solitude. He was sharing its foundation with her. He expected her to say nothing, to just nod and walk away. But she didn't. She stayed there, her gaze on the graves. "They came in the night," she said, her voice quiet, a little hoarse. It was the most she had said since he'd found her. He looked at her, surprised. She wasn't looking at him, she was looking at the dirt, as if the story was buried there. "My pa, he tried to fight them. There were too many." Her voice didn't break, it was flat, a recitation of facts. "They burned the house, the barn, everything. I hid in the root cellar, I could smell the smoke, I could hear my ma screaming." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "When I came out, it was all gone. Just black wood and silence." She finally looked at him. There were no tears in her eyes, just that same terrible emptiness he'd first seen. But now he understood its source. It was the emptiness of a scooped-out life. "They took the horses, all the food. They took me." She looked down at her hands. "This was my ma's," she said, her voice barely a whisper, and he knew she was talking about the frying pan. "She taught me to cook with it. It was on the hook by the hearth. When they dragged me out of the house, I grabbed it. I don't know why. It was the only thing that wasn't on fire." She fell silent again. She had given him her story, a raw, unvarnished thing, offered up in the quiet of the afternoon. It was a heavy gift. He didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't a man of comforting words, so he just stood there with her, sharing the weight of it. He looked at the two graves that held his past, and he looked at the girl standing next to him, a living ghost of her own. He understood now. They were the same, both survivors of a fire. His was a fire of sickness that had taken his family. Hers was a fire of men, but the ashes they were left with were the same color. He reached out, not to touch her, but to a small loose stone on his son's grave. He picked it up and set it back in place, pressing it firmly into the earth. It was a small act of maintenance, an act of remembering, an act of staying. And in that moment she understood that he wasn't going to send her away. They were two ghosts, haunting the same patch of lonely ground. The first sign of trouble came with the changing leaves. A cold snap had them working to shore up the woodpile, a frantic, unspoken race against the coming winter. They were in the woods, Kyle swinging his axe with a steady, powerful rhythm, and she was stacking the split logs when the sound of horses reached them. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider. It was several, and they were clumsy, not trying to be quiet. Kyle stopped mid-swing, axe held ready. He listened. His body went still, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. Danger. He looked at her. A quick, sharp glance, she saw it, understood it. She immediately dropped the log she was holding and grabbed the heaviest piece of wood she could lift. A thick, knotty branch. A makeshift club. They didn't speak. Didn't have to. They moved back toward the cabin, using the trees for cover. Peeking through the pines, they saw them. 3 men on horseback riding into the clearing. One of them was Barlow, the pig farmer. The other 2 were his thuggish-looking ranch hands. They looked drunk, mean. They rode right up to the cabin, dismounting and swaggering toward the door. "Hey, Injun!" Barlow yelled, kicking the door. The sound echoed in the quiet valley. "I know you're in there, hiding with my property." Kyle's jaw tightened. His knuckles were white on the handle of his axe. He motioned for her to stay put, to get behind a thick granite boulder. She shook her head, a small, fierce movement. She wasn't going to hide. She held up her branch, an unspoken declaration. "We face this together." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. He gave a sharp nod. "Fine." They circled around, keeping to the shadows of the woods that bordered the clearing. Barlow was getting impatient. He and his men started trying to shoulder the door open. It was solid oak and it held firm. "Come on out, you coward," one of the hands shouted. "We just want to talk to the girl." That was the moment. Kyle stepped out from behind the trees. Just appeared, silent, the axe held loosely at his side. He was about 50 yards away. The three men spun around, surprised. Barlow let out a nervous, ugly laugh. "Well, look what we got here. Decided to show your face." He unholstered the pistol at his hip. A clumsy, drunken movement. "We've come for what's mine, the girl." Cale didn't answer. He just started walking toward them. A slow, deliberate pace. Not threatening, not rushing, just coming. The two ranch hands looked at each other, suddenly less confident. Cale's silence was more unnerving than any threat would have been. While they were focused on him, she moved. She darted from her cover, running low to the ground, circling to the other side of the cabin. She still had the branch. Barlow saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. He swung his pistol toward her. "Stay right there, girl," he snarled. He never got the chance to aim. The moment his attention shifted, Kyle exploded into motion. He wasn't walking anymore. He was running, covering the ground with a speed that was shocking. He didn't make a sound. Before Barlow could swing the gun back, Kyle was on him. He didn't use the axe blade. He used the flat of it, a brutal, sweeping blow to Barlow's gun hand. A crack of bone. The pistol flew into the dirt. Barlow screamed. The other two men charged, one with a knife, one with his bare hands. But she was there. She came from the side, swinging her heavy branch with all her might. She caught the knife wielder across the back of the knees. He howled and went down. The fight was short, savage, a flurry of motion. Kyle moved with a brutal efficiency, all hard elbows and precise strikes. He disabled the second ranch hand with a kick that sent him sprawling. He stood over a groaning, clutching Barlow. His chest was heaving, but his eyes were cold as ice. He picked up Barlow's pistol from the dust. He didn't point it at him. He just held it. She stood nearby, panting, her branch still held tight. Their eyes met over the fallen men. A shared look of fierce, bloody survival. "Get off my land," Kyle said, his voice deadly quiet. "And don't come back." The men scrambled to their feet, half crawling, half running to their horses. They fled, leaving a trail of dust and curses behind them. Kyle watched them go, his body still humming with violence. She dropped the branch. Her hands were shaking. He turned to her. He saw the tremor. He walked over, took the pistol, and expertly unloaded it, letting the bullets fall to the ground. Then he laid the empty gun on the chopping block and, with one clean swing of his axe, smashed it into twisted metal. A final, definitive statement. The threat was gone. For now. They stood there in the sudden silence, the scent of pine and violence in the air. They had fought together, a raw, survivalist unity. He had protected her, and she, in her own way, had protected him. A new line had been drawn around their small, isolated world. The first snow came early that year, a thick, wet blanket that suffocated the world in white. The valley became an island, cut off from everything. Survival became a daily, grinding ritual. The bond between them, forged in the heat of that first confrontation, now tempered in the cold. It wasn't a bond of words or gentle affections. It was a thing of substance, built from shared labor and mutual reliance. He taught her the language of the woods, how to read the tracks in the snow, the delicate print of a fox, the heavy tread of a bear. He showed her how to build a deadfall trap, his large hands guiding her smaller ones as they positioned the trigger stick. He never praised her when she did it right. He just grunted his approval and moved on to the next lesson. And she learned. She was a quick study, her senses sharpened by a life where missing a single detail could mean disaster. She, in turn, brought a different kind of knowledge to the cabin. She knew how to make their meager supplies stretch in ways he never had. She used her mother's pan to make thin, tough journey cakes that would last for days. She found a patch of late-season rose hips the deer had missed and boiled them into a tart, vitamin-rich tea that helped ward off the sicknesses of winter. One day a blizzard descended on them without warning. It came in like a white wolf, howling and snarling, burying the landscape in a fury of snow. Kyle had been out checking the far trap line, the one up near the high ridge. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk in the swirling snow, began to sink. He wasn't back. The wind shrieked, rattling the cabin door. She paced the floor, her shadow dancing in the firelight. She went to the door a dozen times, opening it a crack only to be blasted by an icy wall of white. She couldn't see more than 3 feet. To go out was suicide, but to stay was to let him die. She made a choice. She banked the fire high. She pulled on the spare pair of winter moccasins he had, stuffing them with dry grass for insulation. She wrapped his heaviest fur around her shoulders, took the lantern and tied a rope to the cabin's door handle, paying the other end out as she stepped into the storm. It was like stepping into nothingness. The wind tore at her, the snow blinded her. She screamed his name, her voice instantly ripped away by the gale. She followed the rope back to the cabin, defeated, but she didn't give up. She put a pot of water on the fire to boil for broth. She laid out every blanket they owned by the hearth, and she waited. She sat by the door, listening past the scream of the wind for the one sound she needed to hear. It was long after dark when she heard it, a scraping sound at the door. She threw it open. He was there, more a creature of ice than a man. His beard and eyebrows were frozen solid. He was covered in snow, leaning against the door frame, barely conscious. He must have been crawling the last 100 yards, following the faint glow of the lantern she'd left in the window. She half dragged, half carried him inside. He collapsed on the floor. His skin was a frightening, waxy white. She worked with a desperate, focused energy. She cut away his frozen clothes with his own knife. She rubbed his limbs with snow, the way she'd seen her pa do with a frostbitten calf, a harsh, painful friction to bring the life back. She wrapped him in the heated blankets and forced spoonfuls of hot, salty broth between his frozen lips. All night, she tended to him, keeping the fire roaring, changing the warm blankets, never sleeping. In the gray light of dawn, the blizzard had passed. The world was silent, pristine, and buried. Kyle opened his eyes. He was lying by the fire, warm and alive. He saw her, slumped in the chair, asleep, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. He knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that she had saved his life. He didn't say thank you. The words would have been too small. He just watched her sleep as the sun rose, casting a pale light across the new, quiet world they now shared. It was a debt that could never be spoken of, only repaid in kind. When the spring thaw finally came and the pass was clear enough for travel, their supplies were dangerously low. Salt, flour, lamp oil. They had to go to town. The thought of it sat like a stone in Cale's stomach. He'd rather face another blizzard than the stares and whispers of redemption's folly. But necessity was a hard master. The trip in was as silent as the one out had been months before, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the wary silence of strangers. It was the comfortable, worn silence of two people who knew each other's spaces. When they rode into the main street, it was as if they'd set off a silent alarm. People stopped what they were doing. Windows suddenly had faces in them. The town had spent the winter chewing on the story of Barlow's humiliation, and it had festered. They emerged from the general store, their saddlebags filled, and the whispers started. Not quiet behind the hand whispers, but loud, deliberate mutters meant to be overheard. There he is, the hermit. A woman with a pinched, sour face said it to her friend, her voice carrying across the street. "Look at her," the friend replied, her eyes raking over the girl. "She ain't got no shame, living out there with him, an Injun." The word was spat out like something foul. The girl, Ilara, though he didn't know her name yet, stiffened. Her chin went up, but a faint flush of color crept into her cheeks. She clutched the sack of flour she was carrying a little tighter. Kyle's face was a granite mask. He ignored them, leading the horse toward the blacksmith's to get a new shoe. Inside the smithy, the big, sweat-soaked man named Gunner didn't even look at them. He just grunted. "What do you want?" "A shoe for the horse," Cale said, his voice flat. Gunner looked at the girl, then back at Cale, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you've taken in strays," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Gotta be careful. Sometimes they carry diseases." Kyle didn't rise to the bait. He just stared at the blacksmith, his dark eyes unblinking. The silence in the forge became heavy, punctuated only by the hiss of hot metal in the quenching tub. Gunner's smirk faltered under the weight of that silent gaze. He was a big man, but there was something in Kyle's stillness that was more intimidating than any muscle. "Fine," Gunner muttered, turning back to his anvil. "It'll cost you extra." As they were leaving, they passed the saloon. A group of men were lounging on the porch, drinking. One of them, a lanky cowboy with a stupid grin, called out to her, "Hey, girlie, you get tired of that redskin, you come see a real man." His friends cackled. She flinched as if struck. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her shoulders hunched. Cale stopped. He turned his head slowly and looked at the men on the porch. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes was enough. It was cold, and it was deadly, and it promised things that no sane man would want. The laughter died in their throats. The cowboy suddenly found his boots very interesting. Cale put a hand on the small of her back, a brief, firm pressure, a silent message. "I'm here. Let's go." He guided her away from the saloon, away from the prying, hateful eyes. He had defended her not with words or fists, but with his presence, with the quiet, powerful threat he carried like a second skin. As they rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the hate behind, she sat a little straighter on the horse. She had faced them and survived. He had stood with her. The world was still a hostile place, but their small patch of it, their valley, felt more and more like the only sanctuary that mattered. They needed a new axe handle. The old one had split during the last of the winter wood chopping. It was another necessary trip to town, one Cale dreaded more than the last. The animosity had been a foul taste in his mouth for weeks. This time it felt different, thicker. The air was charged with a sullen resentment that seemed to follow them down the street. As Cale was negotiating for a sturdy piece of hickory at the mercantile, she waited outside with the horse. She stood quietly, trying to make herself as small as possible, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. That's when she saw him. Jed. The man with the greasy beard and the missing tooth who had sold her on that platform. He wasn't the one who'd come to the cabin. He was the source of it all. He stumbled out of the saloon, drunk and angry, his eyes bloodshot. He saw her. A nasty smile spread across his face, a predator's smile. He swaggered over to her. "Well, well, look what we got here," he slurred, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "If it ain't my little runaway piece of property. Getting a bit above yourself, ain't you?" She said nothing. She backed away, but her path was blocked by the horse trough. She was trapped. "I'm talking to you, girl," he snarled, his face inches from hers. His breath was sour with whiskey. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "That redskin didn't buy you from me. He bought you from Barlow. Barlow still owes me for you, which means you're still my problem." The girl tried to pull her arm away, her face a mask of cold fury. "Let go of me." "Or what?" he sneered. "You gonna get your savage to protect you?" Just then, Cale stepped out of the mercantile, the new axe handle in his hand. He saw it all in a single frozen moment. Jed's hand on her arm, the look of trapped desperation on her face, the gathering crowd, their faces a mixture of fear and ugly curiosity. Something inside Cale, a dam he had built long ago out of grief and isolation, finally broke. He had lived by a code of non-involvement, a vow to never again feel the sting of failing to protect someone he cared for. He had let the world go its own way, content to be a ghost within it. No more. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate, the hickory axe handle held loosely in his hand. Jed saw him coming. "Stay back, Injun," he spat, pulling a knife. "This ain't your business." "Let her go," Cale said. His voice was unnaturally calm. It was the calm at the center of a storm. "I said this ain't," Jed started to say, but he never finished. Cale's motion was a blur. It wasn't a wild swing. It was precise, economical, and brutally effective. He used the axe handle not as a club, but as an extension of his arm. A sharp, powerful thrust to Jed's gut that knocked the wind out of him. A swift crack against the wrist that sent the knife clattering into the dust. A final hard shove that sent Jed stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet, and landing hard in the filthy street. Cale stood over him, chest heaving slightly, the axe handle now held at his side. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the sheer force of the emotion he had just unleashed. The crowd was silent, stunned. He had crossed a line. He had not just defended her, He had claimed his right to defend her, publicly and violently. He had declared without a single word that she was under his protection, that she was his, not his property, his to care for. He turned away from the groaning man in the dirt and looked at her. Her eyes were wide, her arms still bearing the red marks from Jed's grip. He reached out, not to her arm, but to her hand. He took it in his fingers closing around hers. It was the first time he had ever done so. His hand was warm and calloused, a solid, grounding presence. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Jed. He just looked at her, and with her hand held firmly in his, he led her and the horse away, walking straight down the middle of the street as the people of Redemption's Folly scattered out of their path. The ride back was charged with a new kind of silence. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't comfortable. It was heavy with the echo of the violence in the street, with the weight of the line that had been crossed. His hand had held hers for only a moment, but the feeling of it lingered. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red like a fresh bruise. He took care of the horse, his movements stiff and deliberate. She went inside and started a fire, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. The air inside the small room was thick with unspoken things. They ate their meal of bread and jerky in silence, sitting across from each other at the small table. He had never invited her to sit in the single chair before. Tonight, he had pulled a wooden crate over for himself, a silent acknowledgement that things were different now. The space between them felt both vast and infinitesimally small. After they had eaten and the dishes were cleaned, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She sat on her cot, watching him. The flickering light carved his face out of the shadows, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw, the deep-set weariness in his eyes. He looked up and met her gaze. The silence had to be broken. It was her turn. "My name," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "It's Ilara." She offered the word to him like a gift, a piece of herself that she had kept locked away. It was the key to the girl who had existed before the fire, before the rope, before the dust. It was an act of supreme trust. To give a name in this wild place was to give someone power over you. It was to make yourself known. Kyle looked at her for a long moment, letting the name settle in the air between them. He gave a slow, solemn nod, as if accepting a treaty. "Ilara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. It fit her. Then he offered his own in return. Kyle. It was his turn to be vulnerable, to give her a piece of the man who existed beneath the layers of grief and solitude. They were no longer just the hermit and the girl. They were Kale and Ilara. The naming had changed the very atmosphere of the room. It was a confession, an acceptance, a beginning. Having broken the dam, the rest of the story trickled out. He spoke of the fever that had swept through the valley years ago, taking his wife, Lena, and their son, little Matto. He spoke of his own guilt, of feeling that he, with his knowledge of plants and the old ways, should have been able to save them. He spoke of how he had closed himself off, vowing to never feel that kind of loss again by never letting anyone in again. His voice was low and rough, the words coming out in uneven bursts, as if they were stones he was pulling from deep inside himself. When he was finished, a profound quiet fell over the cabin. Ilara didn't offer empty comforts. She didn't say she was sorry for his loss. Words were cheap. Instead, she stood up, walked to the hearth, and picked up her mother's frying pan. She held it for a moment, then turned to him. "My mother's name was Sarah," she said. "She would have liked you. You're quiet like my pa was." It was the highest compliment she could think to give. It was everything. In the flickering firelight, two broken people, having finally named their ghosts and their own true selves, began to see the faint outline of a future they might just be able to build together. The winter snows melted, and the valley floor turned a vibrant, living green. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. The harshness of their survival began to recede, replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythm of a new season. One morning, Ilara woke to find Kale already outside, not chopping wood or checking traps, but doing something she had never seen him do before. He was in the small, fallow patch of earth next to the two graves. With a shovel, he was turning the dark, rich soil, his movement slow and methodical. This was sacred ground, a place of memory and loss he had kept untouched for years. Now he was breaking it open. He was preparing it for something new. She watched him from the cabin door for a long time. He worked with a quiet intensity, his back a strong, solid line against the morning sun. He wasn't just turning dirt, he was turning a page. He was choosing to cultivate life right beside the place where he had buried his greatest pains. This was his confession, his hope, spoken not with words but with a shovel and sweat. After a while, she went back inside the cabin. She went to her small pack, the one she'd had with her since the day he'd bought her, and from its very bottom she pulled out a small, crumpled piece of cloth. She unfolded it carefully. Inside were a few dozen tiny, dark seeds. They were all she had managed to save from her mother's garden before the fire. Wildflower seeds, columbine and Indian paintbrush, useless for food, good for nothing but being beautiful. A foolish thing to have carried through all that she had endured. Small, stubborn speck of hope. She walked outside, the seeds cupped in her palm. Kyle looked up as she approached, pausing his work. He saw the seeds in her hand. He didn't ask. He just watched her. She knelt in the freshly turned earth beside him. The soil was cool and damp against her knees. Without a word, she began to press the tiny seeds into the dirt, spacing them out along the edge of the plot he was tilling for his corn. A splash of defiant color for the edge of his practical crop. He watched her for a moment, then he knelt down opposite her. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a handful of corn kernels, golden and smooth. He began to plant them in the center of the plot, pushing each one into the soil with his thumb. They worked in silence side by side, their hands moving in the same earth. They were planting a garden together, her wild beauty and his sturdy sustenance. They weren't replacing the family he had lost, and they weren't erasing the home she had lost. They were starting something new, on the same ground, a ranch built not just on survival, but on a shared future. A family not of blood, but of choice, of shared wounds and quiet understanding. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they finished their work, their hands covered in the same dark, fertile soil. They had come here with nothing but scars and ghosts. But here, in this quiet valley, with a handful of seeds and a silent promise, they were finally planting a home. Thanks so much for sticking with this story to the very end. If you enjoyed their journey, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel out. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next story we have coming for you.